Step into realms where the heart takes flight, where strategy meets the edge of night. The Dungeons, Dragons, and Psychology Podcast. Prepare your mind. Now be our guest.
Hello and welcome to another session of the Dungeons, Dragons, and Psychology Podcast. I'm your host, Robert Walker, and in today's session, I am joined by DM Rick, the creator of Hammer of the Gods Actual Play Podcast, which is a Geckos Media Production. DM Rick, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
It's very exciting to have you. I got to tell you, I was listening this morning to the most recent episode of Bad Boys of New Alexandria. And holy cow, did your guys have me laughing my ass off during that show. It was hilarious. I think at one point you were doing this whole thing where one of your characters was introducing NASCAR as a sport into like the ancient Greek era. It was really funny.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that is one of my favorite things about the player, Tim, who, is one of the players for the Geckos and Grottos podcast, as well as one of the co-owners of Geckos Media. I mean, he is just amazing. I don't know if you've had a chance to check out Geckos and Grottos, but they are all improv. It's very little of the actual play D&D. It's almost entirely just improv. It's very much the yes and. That's
awesome.
When he does come on and play D&D for real, it just makes it that much more interesting because I never know what to expect whenever he's playing.
Yeah, it seemed like that whole episode was just like a lot of laughs and everybody was having a great time. And I think at one point you said, well, we've had 3 minutes of actual D&D in this 3-hour session, but it was very entertaining to listen to and a lot of fun. So just to ask you, when did you first start role-playing? What got you into it originally?
So I think I was like 10, 11, somewhere in there, back in the second edition days. And I had some friends who they were really into it. I think their older brother had started playing, a few years older than us. And we were just at recess one day and our buddy was like, hey, I learned about this game. I'm going to teach you how to do it. We started playing Magic the Gathering like the same week, and it's just been like that ever since.
Is there a particular system that you are more apt to play or do you kind of jump around a little bit?
Honestly, I know like Dan, one of the players for both our main campaign and for the Bad Boys, he and I had a group for a long time and we were very, very reluctant to switch over to 5e. We just had played third edition forever. Really, really loved it. And then when we finally switched over to 5e, it was rough at first. It was a little confusing, just the differences. But honestly, I don't think I could go back. I love some of the lore and the source material from third edition, but fifth edition is just such a huge improvement.
Yeah, I think I had a pretty similar experience. I started playing with AD&D a little bit, but quickly jumped into third edition and stuck with that 3.5 and stayed with that for most of my gaming career, which I had a brief moment where we tried fourth edition, found that really wasn't our preferred style. And then kind of jumped over to Pathfinder and started playing that pretty religiously. Although with fifth edition, I think that was a nice return to what D&D should have been. So I find that to be a lot nicer than fourth edition was. So I think just skipping fourth edition for me was kind of the right path.
Yeah, I'm very thankful. I never got into fourth edition. I did kind of the same thing that I did with fifth edition. I was just like, I don't want to do it. I like third. Why would I change? And so managed to skip over that. And I've heard there are some cool mechanics like the whole bloodied system and things.
And there's a couple things I have to say, no matter what system I'm running or what game I'm playing in, that we've sort of cherry picked from fourth edition that were really cool.
Right.
Bloodied is one of them. It's a term we always use to describe, kind of our health status now. And the other big one from 4E that we took was skill challenges, which are awesome. And that whole system is...
I'm not sure I'm familiar with that. And I actually just learned from, it might have even been Dungeons and Daddies, where they were talking about bloodied. I'm not sure. A few different places have been talking about it lately, and I had not ever heard of it, just having never played fourth edition. But the more I learn about it, I mean, it is really interesting, gaining those extra abilities once you're below half health.
Yeah, it's a good way to just kind of gauge where your characters are at and know like, oh yeah, this enemy is bloodied. So you're like, okay, good. We're about halfway through this fight, which is kind of a good like check mark. Okay, we're doing a good job. We're making progress.
Right.
So do you have any favorite moments from games that you've been in that you'd be willing to share, or least favorite moments, just something that stands out to you as memorable?
Honestly, my longest running campaign has been the main pod. Aside from that, we would always come up with new characters, especially once we all were out of high school. It was just hard to stick to any campaign. Everybody had, wives or kids or family or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard to pick a lot of favorite moments because most of the time we've just kind of played low-level characters. I will say, I guess it was episode 12 of our show with Gil and the loot that he had with the Wonderwall rune. That was probably one of my favorite. It was a huge mistake. I had found a homebrew, but one of the creators that we follow on Instagram had homebrewed this rune that had the effect of if you sing the tune of Wonderwall, starting with, well, anyway, here's Wonderwall, then it casts Prismatic Wall. And it was fantastic. I really didn't read enough into it. I just kind of made the mistake of saying, well, this is cool. And Gil was supposed to be just a 1 or 2 episode character, just a guest, because at that time we had a pretty consistent cast. And we were like, well, I'd like him to come on. He's been playing D&D basically for as long as I have. We'd started learning it together. So I just thought he would come on. And I did not pay attention to it being a legendary item, didn't really think about the fact that Prismatic Wall is a 9th level spell.
Yeah.
So, the
chaos
the
ensues.
the enemy teleporting in and then Indiana Jones style being melted by the Prismatic Wall was pretty fun. That was really cool. Unexpected, totally unplanned, but I thought it was pretty fun.
I think some of the best moments I always remember are the unplanned ones that just kind of take you by surprise, because I think there's a value in that, being shocked or being surprised by something that really does make it stand out a lot more.
Oh, absolutely.
So do you get to play very often, or are you primarily a forever DM?
Mostly the forever DM. At one point when we had a more consistent group outside of the podcast, Dan, who plays Gil or Bion, depending on which side of our campaign you're listening to, he was DMing quite a bit for a while, but I think he and I both got a little bit frustrated with starting a new campaign every 6 months or so.
That is frustrating.
Yeah, especially because everyone always wanted to start at level 1
right,
and build up. When you get to like level 3 or 4 tops, it's like, well,
and you miss all the high level flavor when you're always starting over again. Yeah,
absolutely.
I've definitely run through that myself. Okay, so our main topic today is alternate history homebrews. And we're talking about using historical fiction as a backdrop for campaign settings. And this is, you use historical events in your live play podcast, and you set it in like the ancient Greek times. Is that correct?
Yep, absolutely.
So can you just tell me a little bit about what your experience has been using sort of springboarding from our real world history and building a fantasy setting out of that?
So realistically, I looking back, I kind of wish that I had done a little bit more research just to know. But at the same time, it's been really fun just learning as I go. I can't tell you how many times I've been trying to think of how to do something mechanically, and then I start Googling, wait, did this exist back then? Like, was this something that I don't remember if it made it in the episode, but there's early on, Jonas had mentioned that they were wearing scale mail. And I remember doing a lot of digging into armor, and I hadn't seen anything up to that point. Everything that I had seen seemed like it hadn't been invented yet. And they just kind of mentioned, well, this is what I had seen. I did some digging, and yeah, it turns out that it wasn't necessarily super common, but it was just interesting finding out that scale mail armor has been around a heck of a lot longer than I thought. And it's just been really cool.
Listening to one of your recent episodes, I remember actually, I believe it was you, but it might have been one of the other characters on the show, was talking about Jewish people being around back there. And that was something that caught me by surprise because I wasn't aware of that fact. So I think that is kind of one of the cool things about using a historical setting, even if you're, changing it very drastically by throwing in magic and fictional characters, but just kind of learning little tidbits of information that you didn't know.
And that was definitely me. That was something that, I always knew that Judaism was one of the oldest still extant religions, but I just never quite thought about when the quote unquote ancient Greek times were versus when like Judaism started. And realizing how much of an overlap there was just blew my mind. The fact that there are a lot of old temples that were Jewish temples and had, statues or other kinds of essentially memorabilia of Alexander the Great is something that I never would have even imagined when I started this. But knowing that, it's just makes it that much more interesting.
It is interesting.
Diverse.
Yeah, I definitely. When you guys were discussing that, I was like, "Oh, holy cow! This is fascinating." Look at all these things I'm learning just by listening to a TTRPG podcast, right?
Hey, that's the goal.
So, can you tell me maybe some of the challenges, though, that you've had in adopting history from our world and into that sort of a setting?
I think one of the biggest challenges, and most people, if you know much about history, there's a lot of problematic stuff. A lot of stuff that I don't want to just whitewash over and say like, oh, well, that didn't happen in this world, but at the same time, I really don't want this to be some doom and gloom, gritty, hardcore TTRPG podcast. I want it to still be a little bit serious, but have some fun with it. And yeah, definitely just seeing how many horrible things happened. That's been kind of tough to adapt. Show, it did happen, acknowledge that it was something that is part of history, but try to move on from it in a positive way.
Was there anything in particular about that setting, ancient Greece, that was most appealing to you in deciding to set your campaign there?
Honestly, I think the biggest thing is I grew up, my whole mom's side of the family, huge into mythology, and Greek was just always kind of the one that I seemed to tend towards. I don't know what it was exactly. Maybe it was just how chaotic and weird and diverse their mythology is and how much information we have about it versus some of the other mythology where we don't have quite as many written stories and as many sources. So for me, just the fact that that was kind of what I grew up on, whether it was reading like Edith Hamilton's mythology, which now I realize isn't always the best source, but you got to learn somewhere, or watching Xena and Hercules as a kid back in the 90s, or Disney's Hercules. It's just always been a big part of my life. And so adapting that into kind of this homebrew world has been a really enjoyable process. And I've loved learning just all the time, every time that I'm prepping for something and I'm trying to just figure out, historical events or things like that would fit in some way. I learn more every single day. So
I actually, some years ago, ran historical setting myself, and it was also set in like the ancient Greece era. And I think one thing about that really, really like spoke to me was it reminded me a lot, the way their gods interact with the people in Greek mythology reminds me of a lot of like Faerun during the time of troubles, where it was just like they're down there on earth, they're asking favors of all their followers, and they're just kind of wreaking havoc and in sort of like a, devil may care sort of it's a lot of fun because you have these huge, larger than life characters that can be part of the story. Have you incorporated many of those into your campaign?
So
we'll be right back.
Hey, Cyclithids, if you love the Dungeons, Dragons, and Psychology podcast and want to help keep it alive, there are a ton of ways you can support the show. Join us on Patreon for exclusive content like NPC character sheets, early access to new products, and even first looks at DM's Assistant app. You can also grab gaming-inspired merch on the Etsy shop, Games for Games, or pick up one of my books, The Player's Handbook to Real Life, or Session Zero, the DMG to Writing Great Campaigns in any system. And even if financial support isn't in the cards for you, you can still help by sharing this show, leaving reviews, or introducing new players to our community. Links are always in the show notes, and thank you for being the heart of our adventure.
I'm trying to think. I believe most of that is stuff that's going to be coming up in future episodes. Especially last year, we got a little bit behind. A couple of the players had jobs that come late spring and into the summer. They were just so slammed that they didn't even have time to play. And we kind of put things on hiatus for a little bit. didn't really post for a little while. But in the meantime, we already had a few episodes recorded, and then since then we have just been recording nonstop. I think we're 10 or maybe even 15 episodes ahead on the main podcast. Yeah, so we have plenty. Even if something comes up, even if people get sick, we can keep cranking them out for a while. But there have been some appearances of some of the gods, more in a minor sense than anything. But definitely as it progresses, I plan to have more of an active role.
Yeah, I think for me, they always showed up more as like quest givers than anything else.
Right.
And not necessarily always through the gods themselves, but sometimes through like their avatar or their emissary or whatever, their priest or priestess. But you're right about the mythology of that world is so rich, and there's so many stories. I mean, the Iliad and the Odyssey and all of the ones that we can think of, like Theseus and the Minotaur. And
right.
There's just such a rich wealth of information that you could run game after game after game in that setting.
Absolutely.
Especially when you're combining it with a whole different world of magic and things that, they obviously believed in.
Right.
So it makes sense to set D&D stories in those worlds.
And I think it's really interesting. Growing up and learning about Greek mythology, I just kind of always assumed that it was sort of kind of like Christianity is, where it's more or less established. There's not a lot of changing to the story and things like that. But as an adult, the more that I've delved into it and realized that there are often multiple versions of the same kind of story, seeing when different authors write the same tale, especially, I guess it's the Let's Talk About Myths podcast. I love her take on some of the myths because she really delves deep and looks for, was this one written by a woman prior to some of the more famous ones? Just some of the other versions that didn't get passed down as much, just really make it interesting to see, depending on the author, what kind of happens and how things play out.
I think another thing about that setting in particular that I like is that they weren't afraid of including dark themes. And there's just something about the seriousness of dark themes that I think helps tell a really good and compelling story.
I absolutely agree. Well, there are a lot of problematic things. It can be a lot of fun to include, the less problematic, but still dark sides of things, I don't know. I'm drawing a blank now. Sorry. The dogs are pretty distracting sometimes. They tend to be like that. Sort of like Zeus, always looking for attention, aren't they? Absolutely.
So I want to touch a little bit more on psychology, because I do like to incorporate that into my show whenever possible. And you do mental health social work in your real life job. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Tell me a little bit about what it is you do, because I'm curious to know kind of how that affects your role playing or your DMing.
Sure. I feel like it probably affects my gaming a lot more than I acknowledge sometimes, especially whenever I'm building worlds. Just thinking about, for example, I know early on that I just kind of off the cuff had talked about in Acadius there being some areas that were a little bit more rough, a little more worn down. And as time's gone on, as I've kind of built this world while we're playing, although I have a pretty good overview, there's a lot of just the more minute details that I didn't even know what to do until we started doing the actual show and playing through it. And just thinking about it and growing as I've been recording this podcast and building this world, I definitely think it's been interesting to just reanalyze and think it doesn't have to be just like the real world, especially being, an American growing up in this system.
Right.
It's pretty imperfect. It has a lot of good things, but there's a lot of things, especially in mental health and social work, that could be a heck of a lot better. I'm sure you know that pretty well. So just thinking about the ways that we could make things better and how I can make this world still dark at times, still fun and diverse and interesting, but make it a little bit better in its own way.
I think for me, one of the things that people who play my games have commented on a lot is that my villains seem very believable. And I think a lot of that has to do with getting a psychology education and understanding that the thought processes that people go through and the choices that they make don't make them any less of a real person. So I think having real villains that have like a history that is understandable and relatable, and you can look at them and say, yeah, man, I don't know if I was in that same position as this guy, I might have made the same choice. And I think that makes a villain like really understandable.
Absolutely. And I definitely think since getting into social work, there's a lot of times where I will work with someone, and when I learn their history, I'm like, man, that's really terrible. Either that you had to go through that, or that you did those things, and just seeing that they've grown from it. They're not most of the time trying to say like, oh, well, I'm okay with these things, or what I did was fine. It's not an issue, just seeing the growth from them. But at the same time, I think kind of where that goes to the TTRPG world is you may not follow that path, that there are some really terrible people out there. But I think kind of what you were saying is they had their reasons for it a lot of times. It's not that they just were born evil and always did bad things. They had kind of that choice, and they went down that path.
Yeah, I always like to use the analogy that I think that a really good villain is the hero of their own story. They see themselves as the hero.
Absolutely.
And I really think that plays in well. If you get to the end of a story where it comes time to do your final face off against the BBEG and whatnot, and the characters have to make a choice between, well, is killing this enemy really the best choice?
Right.
Or is there a path for redemption? And I want him to understand the villain in such a way that is the decision that they're ultimately taxed with, is, what's actually the right thing to do here.
Right. And I think, a lot of what I've been reading recently has been talking about kind of those moral dilemmas in role-playing games, and how those make for some of the most interesting, especially when we're just talking about pure role play, not so much focused on like the combat and things of that nature, but just from an absolute role play aspect. This guy is really evil and does a lot of bad things, but at the same time, he has kind of a point, that
I love that. Yeah. I love bad guys that have a point. And when you look at them, you go, oh man, they're wrong, but also, yeah, they're totally right at the same time.
Right. Like you could tweak a few things and do so much better. You could do so much good for the world.
Right. Yeah.
But in that villain's mind, they're doing what they think is, kind of the Anakin Skywalker, where he feels by having all that power and doing what to most of us would be really, really horrible, that he's making the galaxy a better place.
Yeah, he's going to save the people he loves. He's going to unite a broken, fragmented galaxy and bring it to peace. That is always kind of like his ultimate goal. So yeah, he sees himself as the hero, and I think it takes him right there till the bitter end before he realizes, oh, I should have probably gone about it the way these other people did rather than the way I did. But that is awesome. Yeah. Okay, good talk. That brings us to Tricks of the Trade. So in today's Tricks of the Trade, I've asked DM Rick to come up with 3 ideas of settings for alternative historical homebrew games, and I came with 3 of my own as well. I'll go ahead and share my idea first. My first idea is the Battle of Thermopylae, or the setting where the 300 Spartan warriors held off the Persian army. And it's iconic. It's been in movies. Everybody kind of knows the story, but I've always wanted to be in that story, and I think it would be a really fun place to set a story. Oh,
absolutely. I think that has so much opportunity. You can do a lot with it. Even looking at the movie 300, they take a lot of time. It's not just the start and end of the battle. They have a lot that leads up to it, and it could really make for some, if you're more of a political intrigue kind of player, that could be just a huge aspect of your game.
Yeah, I really like political intrigue. I also like the idea of, how different would that have looked if one side or the other had magic and the other one didn't, right? Maybe that is why 300 were able to hold off so many, is because, they're flinging spells at these millions that are onslaughting them. And interesting concept there.
We hadn't talked about it prior to this, but something that we actually had recorded last summer when things were a little bit chaotic was based around the Greek myth of the Caledonian boar, that we did I think it ended up being like 4 or 5 session little mini campaign just around that, where we took some of the heroes from the actual story. I think we may have come up with some who weren't quite in the story, but could have been reasonably. And I thought that was really cool. We had a fun chase aspect to it. A lot of the interaction with these famous heroes that a lot of them we would know. Some of them are a little bit less well known. And I thought it was just really cool to play with.
It is always a lot of fun bringing in any known concept that the players can identify with, and then be like, oh yeah, that's cool. I know this or this about that individual, or maybe they don't even know much about it, but they get to learn something about it by playing in your game.
Absolutely. I think that has so much, we could have done a lot more with it than we actually ended up doing. as far as like the role play aspect.
Well, and even like the one I mentioned first, the Spartan setting at the Battle of Thermopylae, it could just be like 3 or 4 sessions. It could be part of a bigger story.
Right.
Maybe being a few who survive it and continue on their journey elsewhere, but have that as a big part of their backstory would be kind of cool as well.
Absolutely.
My next idea would be Japan at the introduction of Western culture in the Meiji Restoration, right around 1868, which is around the time of the demise of the Tokugawa shogunate. So
Sure.
the last shogun. And so it'd be really interesting, I think, because you have like the initial emergence of firearms, but you also have these feudal Japanese samurai who are battling as rebels, essentially,
Right.
against the shoguns. And seems like a really cool place for both political intrigue and a lot of like really epic battles.
I agree. And I'm going to tie this a little bit into my second one. Something that I didn't ever really consider when I was learning about history is around that same time would have been roughly the Wild West era in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And just that kind of parallel of, what if you had some of the samurai and some of the cowboys from that era, whether they're taken into Faerun or, Greyhawk or where have you,
Mm-hmm.
just having them interact would be really interesting. And so kind of my second one, the Wild West has a ton of historical stuff that you can base around, whether it is actually some of the Civil War battles or just more focused on like the rough and tumble era, the way things were out there.
I mean, really, when you think about it, the Wild West is a perfect companion to D&D tropes. Like you have people who are roaming the lands as adventurers, collecting bounties, hunting down bad guys.
Right.
It's like everything you want in a great magical fantasy game. It just has, guns and cowboys and instead of fireballs and kobolds or
Yeah,
whatever.
but if you're more of a comics fan, things like Jonah Hex, or even some of the Ghost Rider gets a little bit into that era. Obviously not quite as much, but still the more historical Ghost Riders really just make it interesting where you combine kind of that like the demon, the magical aspect with the Old West. Just I think that has so much potential to explore.
I do like blending worlds together, and I think there's a lot of opportunity for just seeing really unique and fun ideas emerge that
Absolutely.
you don't even think about when you're starting the game, but your players will come up with something and you'll have to respond to it. And it's just like, oh, wow, that's really cool. That would have been neat to have a shootout where one person had a gun and another person had magic missile, right? Like trying to fling it off there. My third idea would be set in the Arthurian era. Maybe your players are playing as like squires to knights, or they're hopeful knights themselves, maybe hoping to become knights of the round table at some point. But just kind of, I like that era, or the mythology of that era in particular, because there is a lot of, Merlin and the concept of magic and the Celtic influence and all that stuff that can play into that traditional European knights in armor and all that stuff too.
Absolutely. I was going to say, it kind of is that perfect blend of the pagan with the Christian, the old school versus the, at that time, kind of new school. And there's just so much you could do with it, especially making it more of a medium to high magic world. Where obviously, we know Arthur and Merlin, there was some magic in those stories, but it was a little bit more of the Lord of the Rings, like kind of subtle magic. But making it a much more high magic world could really be a lot of fun to play in.
And especially you bring in like the concepts of Avalon, and there's still so much, unknown about that you can really do anything with it. When you're given a blank slate of, here's this place of magic and rebirth, you can just build on that with anything from D&D almost.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, my third one would be, it's a little bit more broad, but, just playing in kind of the ancient Celtic world would be a lot of fun. Just their whole system of mythology. While there's not quite as much firsthand knowledge, not as many stories that we have in detail that we do with Greek mythology, it's still just absolutely fascinating. It's something that I would love to play around with. And even, again, had no idea whenever I started out on this that there was a lot of interaction with like the Gauls and the ancient Greeks. Just the way that those worlds blended. And, we kind of know about the Greeks and the Egyptians and how the Greeks kind of adopted some of the Egyptian gods. But I had no idea until I think a couple weeks ago even that some of the Gaulish, the ancient Celtic gods were also adopted similarly by the Greeks. That while they may have been a colonizing people, they had a little bit more of a benevolent, not totally, but a little bit more of a benevolent aspect to it, of more of a blending rather than a forced you have to assimilate to this culture. And I just think it's really cool, that blending of the Greek with the Celtic, or playing more in the like the Roman, where they were trying to overtake the pagan lands.
Right.
It just has so much room for exploration.
Immediately when you're talking about that sort of blended culture, I think of kind of like the dialogues of Plato, or the ways like you could incorporate things we don't really understand, like Stonehenge and how that came into be, all the, the standing stones through all of the Celtic lands and all of this. I mean, there's a huge history of magic and just so many ways you can go with that. Okay. Thank you so much, DM Rick, for being here with me. But before we go, I do want to ask you how my listeners can connect with you, either directly or where they can listen to Hammer of the Gods.
Yeah, so you can listen to our podcast, I believe, just about anywhere you get your podcasts. I know we are for sure available on Anchor.fm, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all the big ones. Mm-hmm. And I would say we're probably most active on our Instagram under the handle of HamPod. So it'd be at HAMMPOD. We also just recently started up a Patreon with the same username, so you can find us there.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here. Listeners, if you like this episode, please check out the Hammer of the Gods podcast. Also subscribe to this podcast and check out my book, Session Zero, the DMG to Writing Great Campaigns in Any System. It's available on Amazon, and you can find a link here in the show notes. I'll go ahead and put a link to the podcast, Hammer of the Gods, as well. Feel free to send me an email if you have any suggestions, comments, or ideas for future shows. The address is all one word, dungeonsdragonpsychology@gmail.com. Thanks again, DM Rick, for being here. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And we'll see you all next session.